Aspects of Occultism by Dion. Narrated by Matthew Schmitz. 8. Pitfalls of Spiritual Healing. The question of healing has always been of prime interest to students of occultism. Discovering the great increase of our knowledge that comes through the doctrines of esoteric science, they cannot fail to realize that it has a practical application in the field of therapeutics. The idealist is especially drawn towards mystical and transcendental studies, and his strong, compassionate impulse leads him to desire above all things to lift the burden of suffering from the world. He is acutely conscious of the limitations of the orthodox methods and keenly anxious for a way of escape from those limitations. The humanitarian impulse and the zeal of the discoverer have been between them made of the occult field a prolific breeding ground for all manner of new ideas in therapeutics and hygiene. The fraternity I work with, being a society for the study of esotericism in all its branches, is frequently asked whether it has any healing circles among its students, or any classes wherein spiritual healing is taught. And when it replies that it has none of these things, it is asked whether it condemns spiritual healing and advises its students against its practice. It may be well, therefore, to define its position, lest misunderstanding arises upon the one side or the other. It is not possible in this matter to give an unqualified yes or no. It is necessary to clear the ground and classify the subject matter before we can do justice to it. But we may briefly indicate our attitude by saying that we believe in spiritual healing, but disbelieve in spiritual healers. Does this mean that we are not interested in spiritual healing? No, it does not. Being a fraternity of the tradition which recognizes Asclepius and Paracelsus, we can hardly reckon the question of therapeutics as alien to us. It means that we take the matter so seriously that we are disinclined to play with it or suffer it to be played with if it is within our power to prevent it. While we are fully alive to the possibilities of spiritual healing, we cannot shut our eyes to the unsatisfactory and even disastrous results that ensue when it is ignorantly or inadequately employed. We desire to see spiritual healing done, but we want to see it done in the right way and under the right conditions, so that the patient shall have the best possible chance that can be afforded him. And that chance is not afforded him when the person who takes charge of his case is ignorant of the problems presented by his condition. Good intentions are no substitute for sound knowledge. Just as the materialists are wrong when they hold man to consist of his physical body and nothing else, so are the mystics wrong when they act as if man were a spirit and nothing else. Man is a sevenfold being, and it is not possible to separate one aspect of his nature from another for any practical purpose, for they are interacting. The only satisfactory healer is the one who has an adequate knowledge of the fourfold nature of man, can diagnose in each terms of the aspects of manifesting life, and treat each level of manifestation according to its needs. Each plane of manifestation has its own laws and conditions. The spiritual plane is governed by spiritual law, the mental plane by the laws of the functioning of the mind. The astral plane has its own laws, and so have the etheric subplanes of matter. Dense matter itself is also a kingdom which has constitutional government. This does not mean, however, that each plane is autonomous. Each level is ruled and ensouled by the next subtlest level, the physical by the etheric by the astral by the mental, and the mental by the spiritual. But although the subtler levels rule and ensoul each its denser neighbor, they rule as constitutional monarchs according to the laws of the country, and not as arbitrary autocrats. Mind can influence matter profoundly, and yet it cannot do just as it pleases with matter. It must always rule by availing itself of the inexorable laws of the physical plane. Even the most extreme school of spiritual healing does not expect a man to grow a new limb. It is content if the repair processes take place naturally by the gradual and normal reconstruction of tissue. In fact, it is content to focus the vis medicatrix naturae at the required spot and let the healing take place by natural means. The great mistake which these spiritual healers make is to refuse to recognize the fact that each plane has its own laws, and that these laws are both the means and the limitations of their art. The great mistake which the materialistic school of medicine makes is to refuse to recognize the fact that each level of manifestation is operated and directed from a subtler plane, and that the happenings and reactions of that subtler plane have got to be reckoned with. The practitioner of orthodox medicine is the heir of generations of systematized research into the nature of the physical machine and has a pretty comprehensive understanding of it. He knows what to do if the system of levers and pulleys we call our limbs come off their rollers. In other words, he can reduce a dislocation. If the length of piping, which is the human intestine, gets a kink in it, he knows the only thing to do is to open up the casing of the machine and disentangle it. If this is not done, the soul withdraws from its useless instrument because no amount of spiritual force is going to drive material substance through a kinked tube, as many a spiritual healer has learnt to his cost. The mundane practitioner, in fact, thoroughly understands the mechanics of the body. Concerning its chemistry, he has a certain amount of understanding, but his knowledge is by no means so complete. He can reproduce in a test tube the processes of digestion. He can mix chemical ingredients and produce an artificial digestive juice, which is just as good as the natural one. But here he is trenching upon the life processes, and he does not understand the nature of life. He cannot tell why it is that under the influence of painful emotion, such as fear, hate, or grief, the stomach will change the nature of the digestive juices it secretes so that they become useless or even actually poisonous. He may be able to reproduce in his test tube these secretions, but he cannot reproduce the influences of emotion upon these secretions. The spiritual healer, on the other hand, can influence the emotions, calm, transmute, and direct them. He and he alone can cure the dyspepsia, which comes from a chronic perversion of the digestive juices by chronic emotional distress. But just as that hydra-headed complaint called stomachache may have its origin in a disturbance of the subtle, emotional aspect of man which acts as the regulator of metabolism, so it may have its origin in a disturbance of the mechanics or hydraulics of digestion. The one case calls for spiritual methods, the other for surgical methods, and that quickly. Who is to decide which it is to be? The only person who is competent to make a diagnosis is the man who has been trained in a general hospital and has seen every variety of disease in the living and the dead. The man who has a clear-cut mental picture of the hidden machinery of the body and the appearances, gross and microscopical, of the processes of disease. He alone knows what is happening and can form a just estimate, for he alone can read the significance of the physical signs. It is for this reason that, although as occultists we have a theory of disease and of therapy, we are different concerning the practice of spiritual healing. It is not because we dispute the validity of spiritual healing when applied to a suitable case, but because we distrust the power of diagnosis of the spiritual healer and recognize his liability to get hold of an unsuitable case and make a most lamentable mess of it. It is all very well for the fanatical adherent of spiritual healing to say that God is omnipotent and that spirit is all and matter nothing. I am not prepared to argue the metaphysics of the case. The final court of appeal must always be experience, and experience, unfortunately, does not bear out their contention. Spiritual healing has its limits, whether spiritual healers admit it or not. They are far from being uniformly successful, as they would be if their hypothesis were correct. Because God is omnipotent does not mean that he is as arbitrary and incalculable as an Eastern despot. May we not conceive that he works through law, and that his omnipotence lies in the inviolable nature of his laws. Are not the laws and limitations of matter just as much his ordinances as the laws of spirit? When a so-called spiritual healing results in the cure of bodily ills, it has, ipso facto, become a physical healing. A spiritual healing that remained literally a spiritual healing would never take effect on the plane of matter at all. Spiritual force must be transmuted down the planes and manifest in matter in order that a change of physical condition may take place. Equally, may it not be that the successful result of medical treatment or of an operation should really be accounted a spiritual healing. If it is our karma to die, we die, despite anything that can be done for us. If it is our karma to recover, why should not the spiritual forces manifest through the skill of the surgeon as well as through the mind of the healer? Why do we rope off any section of the healing art and say that here God does not operate? All healing is spiritual when rightly understood, because life itself, in essence, is spirit. It is this unhappy antagonism between the materialist and mystic exponents of the healing art that is to be deplored. The patient needs both, for it is not possible for any level of the composite man to be afflicted without the disturbance spreading up and down the planes, and repair is never a process of one plane only. in judging the suitability of a case for spiritual healing, there is another factor to be considered, as well as the physical nature of the complaint, and that is the spiritual status of the patient. Is it justifiable to use spiritual forces to restore a physical sense of well-being to a materially minded man suffering from overindulgence? Is it justifiable to accept as a subject for spiritual healing a person who cares nothing whatever for spiritual things and merely wants to be relieved of his discomfort? Before we can answer this question, we must answer another. What is a spiritual healing? For there are several kinds of non-physical healing, and not all of them are spiritual. True spiritual healing is really character healing, whereby karma is abreacted and the patient freed from the after-effects of forces he himself has set going in the past. By far the greater part of what is loosely called spiritual healing is really mental healing, wherein the power of the mind over the body is exploited, and it has no more real claim to be called spiritual than has Ku's method of autosuggestion, to which it is closely akin. Baudouin, making his marvelous analysis of Ku's method in his most valuable book, Suggestion and Autosuggestion, reveals the modus operandi of all non-physical healing, showing exactly how the subconscious mind manipulates the body. It is always emotion, not will, which is the driving force. In the case of a spiritual healing, it is a spiritual emotion derived from mystical experience. In the case of mental healing by suggestion, which is what the greater proportion of non-physical healing really is, it is the emotion of faith and hope induced by the prestige of the healer, which is the motive power of the change of consciousness that affects the healing. When the healer is alleged to be a disincarnate spirit, this contention is not invalidated, for surely, if we have learnt anything from occult science, we have learnt that death makes no difference to us. We have only shed our bodies. The spirit healer merely has to his advantage the added prestige of being something unusual. Though the force that heals may be purely spiritual in its inception, it nevertheless has to be translated down the planes before it can take effect on this physical body. Mind cannot manipulate matter, but mind can manipulate the etheric double, which is the matrix of matter. But as Baudouin has shown, the level of the mind which is in touch with the etheric double is beyond the reach of the will. We must therefore, in seeking to manipulate it, find a substitute for the directing influence of the conscious will. We find this in the spontaneous effect of emotion working through an image in the imagination. Genuine emotion, and none other has adequate motive power, cannot be produced at will. Ku realized this and found his substitute for emotion in long-continued attention, hence his introduction of the knotted piece of string and the repetition of a formula. In true spiritual healing, the alterative emotion is evoked by mystical experience. In the average mental healing, it is evoked by the prestige of the practitioner. In psychic healing, it is produced by telepathic suggestion. In all cases, the modus operandi is the same: the automatic mind of the patient, the lowest level of subconsciousness which controls the etheric double, is manipulated and is the vehicle of the healing. As soon as we touch the subconscious mind, we touch the hidden springs of the personality, and whoever does this exceedingly potent thing needs to know what he is about. Nothing is more misleading than the obvious in this sphere. The subconscious mind, when disturbed, turns itself upside down, transfers its emotions from their real object to a symbol, and tangles the trail beyond all disentangling by anyone but an expert psychologist. Nowhere are fools more ready to rush in than in the sphere of comforting emotional disturbance. Someone tells them a pathetic and plausible tale, and they accept it unquestioningly. Little do they realize what is at work below the surface. Take the following case as an example. It is typical of many. A man possessing a good deal of personality and magnetism finds that he is able to help people, to cheer them when depressed, to vitalize them when weary, and even relieve pain by his touch, and he sets up as a spiritual healer. He may or may not, in addition to these primary qualifications, study natural therapy or manipulative treatment. His chief stock in trade, however, is his personal influence. He has what is called in the orthodox healing profession a good bedside manner. He is probably able to help a great many people in various ways, his chief asset being that he gets them to help themselves in a way that the medical practitioner who relies solely on his pharmacopoeia is unable to do. He probably has in him the makings of a first-class doctor, but the opportunity to qualify has been denied him. His natural intuitiveness and shrewdness are soon reinforced by practical experience, and he probably reads medical books as well and acquires a smattering of ideas on the subject. All goes well for a time. He does some good and no lasting harm. As the naturopath remedies are not drastic, one can play a great many colored lights on people without doing them any damage and put them onto some very queer diets without giving them anything worse than the hiccups. Mental and spiritual methods of treatment in normal people are at worst ineffectual and do not produce drastic reactions. There are, however, certain pitfalls in his path which he is not in a position to avoid, as will be clearly seen when they are explained. Among his patients are certain cases complaining of exactly the same symptoms. They are easily tired, depressed, out of sorts, and with feelings of ill-defined malaise. Not really ill, yet never well, with perhaps various odd symptoms thrown in as make-weights. Anyway, whatever may be the matter with them, the human machine is running badly. He applies approximately the same treatment to all of them, treatment which has benefited many other cases with similar symptoms. Now let us consider their history, and let me say that these cases are not imaginary. I have seen many of each type. Case number 1 reacts to the treatment by exploding like a bomb. It is a case of sex repression, and the dammed-up forces are let loose upon the unfortunate healer, his magnetism having proved all too effective. And as hell knows no fury like a woman scorned, she tells all her friends that he has attempted to outrage her, and they probably believe her, for a more fiercely virginal person could not possibly be imagined. She may ultimately go to the police with her tale, but here she will get a less sympathetic reception, for it is an old story here, and the police are wise in human nature. Now, what would the qualified medical man do with such a case? He does not put much faith in symptoms that are unaccompanied by signs. He knows that if the patient complains of feeling unusual sensations, there will be something to show for it somewhere. It may be in the blood seen under the microscope. It may be in an electrocardiograph of the heart. One or another of the innumerable modern methods of diagnosis will reveal something abnormal somewhere. The qualified man has at his disposal resources which are denied to his unorthodox rival, and with their aid he is able to explain the abnormality in terms of physiological function, which is the only real solution of any problem of disease. He quickly detects the hysterical case because he knows that the symptoms she complains of ought to be accompanied by corresponding signs. When these are lacking, he does not attempt to treat the physical condition, which is probably not in need of treatment, but sends his patient for psychological treatment, and the specialist who deals with the case never sees her alone because he knows what is at the bottom of her trouble. Surely it is obvious, when one understands the mechanism of such a case, that to pour more life force onto a person who is already suffering from congested life force is to provoke a catastrophe. Now let us consider case number 2. The symptoms are much the same, treatment is given, and an improvement, possibly considerable improvement, results. The patient is able to take up activities that have had to be given up. The case is hailed as a cure. The healer's reputation and self-confidence go up. Presently, however, the case begins to go downhill again, gradually. Treatment is renewed, improvement results, cured again. Then once more the trouble starts, treated again, cured again. Does it occur to anybody to notice that the exasperations take place at the rise of the sap and the fall of the leaf, and ease off when the change of season is established? Then one day, something occurs which cannot be ignored. The patient suddenly collapses, with blood pouring from the mouth, to the horror of everyone, and the healer most of all. Most people know what that means. A doctor is called in and says, "If I had seen this case when the trouble first showed itself, it could have been cured. Now it is only a matter of time till the end." But that is not all. The doctor will want to examine what he calls contacts, the people who have been in close touch with the patient, and when he does so, he will find some of the adults and most of the children have been infected, for tuberculosis is infectious, and children are especially susceptible. And now for case number 3. We have much the same tale, vague ill health and some slight local symptoms. It does not yield to spiritual treatment, but the treatment is persevered with. A homemade diagnosis is arrived at and various nature cure remedies are tried, without result. When the case finally comes into medical hands, the diagnosis is cancer too far gone for operation. Finally, let us consider the lesson case number 4 has to teach us. The same history as before, nothing much to show for it but chronic ill health. Then things become worse. The symptoms declare themselves obviously as paralysis, heart trouble, kidney trouble, anything. The spiritual healer recognizes the nature of the complaint all right. It stares him in the face. And what is the ultimate diagnosis in this case? The doctor is not quite so ready with it as the spiritual healer, though he does not deny his interpretation of the symptoms. The heart or the kidneys are involved right enough, that is agreed. Nevertheless, he takes a specimen of the patient's blood for examination. Presently, he prescribes a course of treatment which will last 2 years. The case clears up rapidly, and yet the doctor will not let his patient go, but insists that the treatment continue. He also says there must be no more children till the end of the 2 years, and when we see what the child is like who was born before the treatment commenced, we are not surprised. Why is it that the doctor can cure this patient and God cannot? Perhaps God does not particularly want to under the circumstances. When our Lord healed one of these sufferers who came to him, he said, "Go and sin no more." But I do not suppose it ever occurred to the spiritual healer to say this to his patient, nor did he think to ask questions concerning a long-forgotten moral lapse. These are 3 diseases which, between them, are responsible for more ill health than all the others put together. They are all 3 insidious on their onset, multiform in their symptoms, striking any structure in the body and producing different effects in different cases. They are all amenable to treatment at the outset and incurable when well established. And they all 3 need to be diagnosed by means of laboratory tests, and 2 of the 3 can be given to other people by the sufferer. Is the spiritual healer in a position to recognize the incipient stages of tuberculosis, cancer, and syphilis? I have spent all my life in circles that went in for unorthodox healing of one kind or another, and I have seen so many of the resistant cases which turned out in the end to be one or another of these 3 that although I am not prepared to say that spiritual forces cannot heal them, I think we are justified in concluding that they are extremely resistant to spiritual healing and that far better results are obtained by physical methods if they are applied in the early stages. But in saying these hard things of spiritual healing, I do not wish to discredit it en bloc. I have seen cases of serious illness in which the diagnosis was as well established as it was possible to be, healed by spiritual means when all physical resources had failed, and I have seen cases that were healings right enough in that the patient was cured of hysteria, though these were not the cures of dire physical maladies that they were reputed to be. But these 2 types of cure form but a small percentage of a most deplorable morass of sheer foolishness, credulity, and charlatanry. The weakness of spiritual healing lies in 2 things. Firstly, in the inability of the spiritual healer, whatever may be his healing powers, to make a diagnosis and determine what cases are suitable for his ministrations and what are not. And while he is trying his methods and finding out, the time may have gone by when a cure was possible in the case of the 3 dread scourges referred to. Relying on the power of God, the spiritual healer, at the beginning of his career, will take on anybody who has still got the breath of life in them. In fact, I have myself seen several cases of attempts to raise the dead. Later in his career, however, he is usually more cautious unless he is a charlatan, and then he diagnoses, not his patient's disease, but his credulity and his purse. It is this refusal of the spiritual healer to recognize his limitations which does so much harm, for spiritual healing can be very valuable when used in its proper sphere. Secondly, although there are practitioners of spiritual healing who obtain results in suitable cases, it is my experience that the general run of people who come to tell me that they want to take up spiritual healing have got 2 things in common: a complete innocence of any scientific knowledge and an equally complete ignorance of life's problems. They rush in where angels fear to tread, and in all too many cases the poet's classification of them is correct. They are either well-meaning and rash or mercenary charlatans. The very few, who fall into neither of these classifications are not among those who advertise their wares in the many trashy little periodicals that cater for the spiritual equivalent of the get-rich-quick and gold-brick industries. I do not think it is possible for a spiritual healer to make a profession of his powers, taking all comers like a panel doctor. Real spiritual healing is a thing that goes very deep, and there are very few cases to which it can rightly be applied, and the choice of these cases does not depend upon the nature of the disease, but upon the spiritual condition of the patient. It is to my mind a lamentable thing that spiritual healing should ever have been allowed to become separated from physical healing, for every sick man needs both, though the proportions in which he needs them vary in different cases. The ideal doctor is one who, like the ancients, is priest as well as physician, But such are rare, and what shall we do to cope with our immediate problems that are pressing for solution? To whom shall we entrust our case in the unhappy state of affairs prevailing among us, in which we have to choose between a doctor who knows nothing about our souls and a spiritual healer who knows nothing about our bodies? The choice is often a difficult one, and it is greatly to be regretted that spiritual and physical healing should thus be divorced, for a patient has both mind and body. Personally, I do not think they should be, nor need they be if neither party were fanatical and each limited himself to his own province. Spiritual healing is, after all, of the kingdom of the spirit, and no doctor interferes with his patient's religious convictions. The spiritual healer, unfortunately, seems to think that although, according to his hypothesis, material remedies have no power to cure disease, they have plenty of power to interfere with his treatment and prevent it from being effectual. Nor has he any scruples about passing from the plane where he has knowledge to the plane where he has no adequate experience and directing the physical regime. It appears to me that our wisest course, until such time as the ideal shall be available, is to entrust our sick bodies to the man who has the widest experience and the best equipment, that is to say, the qualified medical man, and to supplement his efforts with the ministrations of a spiritual healer if we feel we need them. No reasonable doctor would object to what are, strictly speaking, the ministrations of religion, provided that the spiritual healer restricts his efforts to spiritual matters and leaves the physical plane alone, as he would be well advised to do. If his efforts are successful, the doctor will report the success. When all is said and done, the main thing is that a suffering body should be eased and a suffering soul tranquilized, not the manner in which credit is to be apportioned between rival practitioners and their methods. Approached in this way, a rapprochement is possible, but no doctor is going to tolerate the interference of a spiritual healer who pulls against him and advises the discarding of his remedies and the disregarding of his advice. The patient will abandon his remedies quickly enough, and with the doctor's consent, when the cure has been effected. It is fanaticism on the one hand, and not a unjustifiable exasperation on the other, which makes the difficulties. No doubt, many of the prejudices we deplore originated in the phases through which medicine went in the course of its history. In medieval times, when the church dominated every detail of society, all healing was spiritual in that its appeal was almost exclusively to faith and imagination, and was combined with the most complete disregard of common sense. Ambrose Pare, the father of surgery, might well say, "I dressed his wounds and God healed him." In other words, I let him alone and gave nature a chance. When the medical mind shook off not only the dominance of the church, but also the prestige of the ancients, and relied exclusively on experiment and observation, progress was extraordinarily rapid, and results so fruitful that the spiritual factor was completely overwhelmed and vanished from the medical purview. The only person who remembered it was the patient, and his voice got little hearing in the age of reason, which saw the development of modern medicine. With the coming of the new psychology, however, the mental factor in the human makeup has been forced upon the attention of the medical world and is receiving more and more recognition. It is difficult to pick up the current number of any medical journal and not find somewhere in its pages a reference to this factor, and those who give it most weight are among the most prominent men in their profession. So far, so good, and such recognition of a non-physical factor in physiology is a great gain, but it does not go far enough, as its exponents will soon discover. There is a spiritual as well as a mental factor to be reckoned with in dealing with human beings, and the weakness of psychology lies in the fact that it has no means of measuring or dealing with this factor. Psychoanalysis may take a mind to pieces expertly enough, but it does not very frequently succeed in putting it together again and making it work. To my way of thinking, it is a method of diagnosis rather than of treatment. The only person who ever succeeds in putting a mind together again is the spiritual healer in the true sense of the word, because he alone possesses any knowledge of the only synthetic principle in the nature of man, and that is the spiritual principle around which all the rest is built up, the divine spark, which is the nucleus of his being. When the mind is taken to pieces, it is this vital nucleus, the basis of each individualized existence, which is laid bare, and when the mind is put together again, it must be reconstructed in relation to this nucleus. When we remember, moreover, that this nucleus does not exist by and of itself, but is of the nature of a ray from the central sun of life, we shall see that no reconstruction can be adequate which takes no account of its relation to its source. And equally, if man is a fourfold being of body, emotions, mind, and spirit, he must dwell in a fourfold environment of physical, astral, archetypal, and spiritual conditions. These must all be understood and taken account of by whosoever would heal the whole man. But where are we to find such physicians as these? Esoteric science alone holds the key to the situation, because the initiate alone has an understanding of the planes of existence and is equipped to cope with them. It is too much to hope that the day will ever come when the medical profession as a whole will be a temple of initiates. The gifts that make the initiated priest-physician are rare, and there is a vast amount of honest spade work which must be done by less gifted men. But I hope and believe that the day will come when human thought as a whole, and not only that of the medical schools, will recognize the part played by the emotions and imagination in our physical states, in both health and disease. When everyone will have some elementary knowledge of the hygiene of right thinking, just as school children are taught simple ideas concerning the hygiene of the physical body, and that we shall all recognize that we can poison each other with harmful suggestions, even if kindly meant. Every medical student ought to be taught the power of the mind over the body and trained to utilize it in his work. Every probationer in a hospital ought to be drilled in the psychology of suggestion, as she is drilled in the technique of asepsis, till it becomes second nature, and she would no more think of ignoring the part played by the imagination and emotional states in the welfare of a patient than she would think of taking unsterilized instruments from one bed to another. This is the most we can hope for within the realm of practical politics, and it is my belief that this state of things is nearer than might be believed, and that the present generation will see its establishment among the heads of the profession at any rate. Science is, after all, not a body of arcana, but a method of dealing with any sort of facts, from market gardening to metaphysics. The essence of science does not lie in knowledge, but in method. It is here that the quack differs from the trained man. He may have acquired a liberal proportion of the trained man's knowledge, but he lacks his method and the disciplined mind which is the basis of his method. Consequently, his knowledge will always be a rule of thumb affair, having no basic principle. Speaking for myself, I have little faith in the untrained mind and little love for the impractical dreamer, however idealistic. I have therefore never attempted to put into practice the knowledge of esoteric medicine, which has come down to me as part of the heritage of the Western esoteric tradition. Neither have I been willing to impart it to the many spiritual and psychic healers who at one time or another have got into touch with us and asked for this information, for I have seen too much harm result from their untutored efforts to have any faith left in them. The only people who can rightly use this knowledge are the men and women who have already got the necessary basis of scientific training and clinical experience. The therapy of the subtle body must be grafted onto the rootstock of the therapy of the dense body, because, for all practical purposes, they cannot be separated until death parts them permanently.